Okay. So welcome everybody to our final regular session of the conference on Futures of Canadian Comics. We've got some wonderful presenters with us here. I'm just going to start with a land acknowledgement based on my current location. So we're all, of course, coming together from different parts of the country, but I am speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. Even as the pandemic prevents us from gathering in one place, it continues to be important to remember that we're guests here even when we're online. So as I think I'll follow the format that other people have been doing and not read all the bios, because we can put them in the chat and save ourselves a little bit of time, even though I love reading bios and celebrating everybody's fabulous achievements, but we can do that hopefully within the context of our discussion. So I think how we'll just proceed with, again, seems like how other panels have been proceeding, is to just give everybody a chance to give us a brief introduction to themselves and their work. Hopefully everybody has watched the presentations already, but just remind everybody about sort of where you're coming from to refresh our memories in case we watched your presentations a few days ago or anything like that. And we'll just proceed in the order that everybody's listed in the program. And I will lead everybody in a discussion, hopefully a fruitful discussion, and afterwards we will open things up to questions from the audience. Oh, by the way, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Anna Peppard. I study sex and gender in comics, primarily in the American context, so I've been doing a lot of learning here today, even though I'm a Canadian scholar. I'm currently contract faculty at Sheridan College, but have been attached to York University and Brock University in the past. Going by the order of the program, we would start with a short intro from Leah, Brochu, and Rachel Osolen. I hope that's close. Apologies. If the two of you would want to give sort of a brief intro to your presentation, remind us of your work, that would be fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. My name's first, so I'll say hi first. I'm Leah Brochu. I'm in the Edmonton, Alberta area. If anyone's interested in that, Rachel and I work for an organization called NELS, the National Network for Equitable Library Service. And we have a focus on, it's a nonprofit organization that kind of works to make accessible books and make those books available to people with print disabilities. So a few years ago, we got a request from a user from a blind person for an accessible version of The Walking Dead. So we only did the first 6 comics. Obviously it would be insane to do all of The Walking Dead because it's huge. But we started developing a method of describing comics that still was working on making the comics engaging. So in our presentation, when we're talking about the future of comics in Canada, we just touched on some kind of options that people are exploring, which is like tactile graphics or braille or audio or kind of digital approaches that makes comics more inclusive to people with print disabilities, which might be blindness, might be something physical like a mobility issue, or some cognitive impairments as well. All those kinds of things. I'll let Rachel say hi and maybe follow up on anything I missed.
I think you got most of it. It's Rachel Osolen. No one ever pronounces it right because it's so close to Osolen. It's this weird little Latvian name. But yeah, I was originally in Edmonton, but now I'm in Hamilton, Ontario. And Leah covered most of it. We do have, I run production at like in-house production at NELS. So I help create all the accessible versions of book requests for our users with print disabilities. And we are continuing to test and create comics in-house when we can. The way you make a described comic is very laborious. So we don't create many of them. And we're always looking for funding so we can do more experimentation and user testing. So we really, really believe that if you are going to make accessible comics, you have to have user testing. It has to be tested with people who have print disabilities, who use the technology, who understand the technology, who use Braille, all of the above. So you know that you're actually creating something that will be useful for your reader.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Leah. Next on our list is Sandra Dumay. If you would like to tell us a few words about yourself and your work, that would be awesome.
Hi, yeah, I'm an illustrator and author in Montreal. I grew up in Toronto, been here for quite a while, and I started out I've been doing comics for a really long time in the form of like a diary. Oftentimes I do comics about like difficult things I'm going through, and I do sort of the highs and lows of my day, which have turned into so many different kinds of series. And then I also I have a really goofy, fun comic book for young readers that's very like physical humor and silly, and I like also dark, deep comics. So I really appreciate the form of comics to do all kinds of things, but I do use it a lot to sort of document what's happening in my life, talk about difficult things, and then I do a lot of comic drawing with kids. So I teach comic making and comic drawing with kids. And I've been doing actually so much of it virtually, which is so surprising. It's going really well. I have sometimes big classes of kids, and we learn how to draw faces and different emotions, and we make faces into the camera, and then they come up and they show me all their drawings. And so I've been doing that quite a bit lately, and it's so fun. So that's my work.
That sounds awesome. That sounds like a great way to connect with people. I love the idea of that exercise of doing the expressions. That's very cool.
Yeah, it's fun.
Amy Mazawita, if you would like to give us a little intro to yourself and your work.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me. First of all, I'm really excited to be here and speak with everyone. I'm a PhD student at Concordia University. I'm currently living in Winnipeg because of the pandemic. So it's been kind of an interesting first year and a half or so of my PhD program, doing everything online. And my research today is focused on representations of and engagement with mental illness comics on Instagram. And I actually engaged with Sandra's comics in my presentation that I shared. So I was really excited to be in conversation with her today. But I mostly focus on the comments and the communities that are kind of forming around these comics that are posted on Instagram with Sandra's and other comics that are doing kind of similar work on social media. And I'm really interested in looking at how comics about mental health in relation to the pandemic and also not related to the pandemic are kind of developing these networks of care between users. And yeah, that's basically the gist of my presentation.
Yeah, I love that the two of you are going to be in such wonderful dialogue in this discussion today, which is great. Hopefully we'll get you talking to each other a little bit. So our fifth presenter is Eva Karpinski. Eva, if you would like to say a few words about yourself and your work.
Hi. First of all, I'm super happy to be here, and I'm extremely grateful to the organizers and all participants for sharing your abundant resources. I know that my work and my teaching are going to be so much richer for those 2 days that I spent in the company of comics loving people. I posted my land acknowledgement in the chat. So I also want to say that until maybe an hour ago, I felt that my contribution was a little bit of an outlier, but then we started talking about comics as scholarship a little bit more and integrating comics into research. So that is, what I focus on in my talk. I teach gender and women's studies and life writing in the School of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at York in Toronto. And I integrate as much as I can of comics as a tool, drawing tool for students, because I co-teach a course with Alison Mitchell, which is on drawing politics, so narratives of resistance, feminist resistance, activist resistance. But I also teach methodology. So these are two different contexts where I, apart from engaging with comics as primary sources in my own research on graphic biographies, but I also kind of like veer towards comics as a piece in a methodological toolkit that my students and my even graduate students, PhD students can go for and incorporate into their work. So what I do in this presentation, in the first part, I focus on what affordances comics provide for conducting academic research. And I use examples from my own classrooms, but also from what's available at York, or on some of the wonderful, wonderful resources that I can post here. All my references actually in one go. Yeah, here it is. Okay. So Somatosphere has an image text series. And this is, of course, and then Imaginative Ethnography has a wonderful blog on using comics in ethnography. And there's, of course, graphic medicine. And the last one is to the U of T ethnographic series, which I kind of showcase in my presentation. But in the context of research, I show examples of how to use comics to elicit data from the participants, for instance, in a focus group, or how to use comics, how the researcher can use comics to validate their findings or do reflexivity, reflect back on what's going on in the research process. And then the final kind of obvious application is dissemination of research, and that's what brings me to those new scholarly opportunities, publishing opportunities in scholarly presses. So what Matthew actually presented in his paper in the previous panel is an example of dissemination, but it does more than, and as he pointed out, it does a lot more than just illustrate some academic arguments. It allows to visualize complexity. It allows for contradictory perspectives, for ambiguity to remain within the frame. So it's kind of like softening the edges of scholarship that, especially in the social sciences, where you have to have results, where you have to insist on often quantifiable data. Comics sort of like, bring that ambiguity and allow for a sense of incompleteness or questioning to remain within the frame. So I have some examples of that. In the second part, I focus on ethnographic, which is an example of this absolutely innovative, collaborative, transnational, multi-platform, multimedia scholarly publishing, where they invite, ethnographers mostly and anthropologists to produce books with them. And this is indeed a collaborative process. So it shows that actually it demystifies knowledge production as this, single one person focused process. It literally shows an incredible team that has to be behind any such project. A lot of our discussion veered towards the market at the end of the previous session. So here we also have that paradoxical kind of, ambivalent moment where I say that comics, the gentrification of comics happened in the neoliberal academia, where demands for accountability, transparency, for public-facing research have actually led to insisting on an accessible and public-facing and community-oriented, knowledge production. So there's a lot, I know, and I feel like I was probably the only one who couldn't really squeeze my material into 10 minutes. That was allotted to each of the presenters. Felt very, very guilty about it and still do. But I hope we can have more conversation about it. Thank you.
We can absolutely have more conversation about it, and let's do that now. So I was trying to think of connections between all of your presentations, in addition to thinking kind of about the theme of the panel in general. And sort of one of the connections that I was thinking about was sort of the emphasis on the adaptability of the comics form, sort of in all of your presentations. You're all speaking to that from a slightly different perspective. And it made me think about something from Aaron Kashtan's book, Between Pen and Pixel, Comics, Materiality, and the Book of the Future, which is a really great book. He talks about how the multimodality of comics could actually point to the future of publishing more broadly, as we perhaps move away from traditional print culture, perhaps. I'm not saying we're doing that, or at least move further into sort of options for digital and hybrid media, something we've obviously all been thinking about a lot during the pandemic. And I really love that claim, since it speaks back to sort of certain enduring assumptions about comics being a limited or quote unquote simple medium. So I was wondering if each of you would be willing to speak to that proposition a little bit in terms of, and I'll narrow it down a little bit for you. Do you think comics are uniquely adaptable or flexible, maybe was another way of putting that? Do you see comics as an artistic form that's particularly well equipped to address sort of the changing needs of a changing world? and maybe it speaks to that question of futurity a little bit, and why or why not? And maybe I'll start with you, Leah and Rachel. Are there special challenges, but also special opportunities when we think about ways to make comics more accessible to blind and low vision readers? Obviously, you've spoken about your process in your presentation already and a little bit here, but do you think that that's sort of a fair thing to say, that comics are both uniquely adaptable, but perhaps also like uniquely challenging to adapt? Or what would your take on kind of that question or statement be? I just would love to hear you speak on it.
Do you want to go first, Rachel?
Okay. I think that's actually a very true statement for adapting comics into accessibility formats. And I think it's true for like a number of reasons. Like Leah and I have been fortunate enough to go to a couple other conventions. Recently we went to one for blind comics, and we got to listen to a bunch of presentations on people who are teaching how to make comics accessible, and also people who have lived experience and what they would like in their comics. So I think that the main challenge would be is if you're dealing with someone who can't see and who perhaps has never seen and absorbs information differently. It doesn't mean that the visual information isn't as important. It just needs to be structured a little differently and described a little differently. And that can be but that's where the challenge comes in, is trying to re-describe that or recreate it in a way that's good for someone in that situation. But one of the biggest challenges, and also I think the biggest room for the most creativity, which I think comics are perfect for this, because comics are all about creative ways to tell stories. And we really need creativity in accessibility, right? Because I mean, people with print disabilities is everyone from someone who's like, someone who has autism and has sensory problems, to someone who is legally blind, to partial vision, to someone who has Parkinson's and can't hold a book anymore, right? So it's a big spectrum. But even within that spectrum of disabilities, people have different desires and wants, right? Like through Leah and I's research over the last couple of years, and through our conversations with a wonderful rainbow of different types of professionals and readers, we've discovered that one of the biggest themes is that there can't be one solution for accessibility, because some people will be like, hey, I really want to have that, what we kind of termed like the comic book experience. So like you're recreating a comic as exactly as possible, so people can know what a speech bubble is, and they can know what motion lines are and stuff like that, and they can have that. They can get all the little pieces. When other people are just like, no, I don't want that. That's too much information. Like, I'm okay with something a little more simple, like Sandman, which uses a lot of sound and music. And it's a really, really beautiful production, but also incredibly expensive production, right? So you got to think of, there can't be just one solution, but it's also really exciting because there's a lot of ways to be really creative. And like we covered this in our presentation, there's already people out there that are making some really, really beautiful different types of modalities for comics. And I think that's just going to get more and more interesting, and more people with lived experience are getting involved in writing comics. And it's always been my belief in accessibility for literature, that if you can have the creator build in accessibility into their creation, that's the best way to do it. Because then you're translating exactly what the artist wanted to convey within the piece. Yeah.
Yeah, did you want to add to that, Leah?
I mean, that covers a lot of it. It's such a broad topic, because there's so many different ways of making things accessible. There's so many different desires of the readers, and I think that it is uniquely adaptable, as in your words, because creators can just, pick so many different ways about incorporating accessibility, like whether they want to just, create image descriptions or make a braille text, or there's a lot of room for for creativity and exploration, and that'll speak to, you know, different members of the audience, and some people will love it. So I think, yeah, I think that's all I'll add, is that it's there's a lot of opportunity for unique approaches, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, right? Because you have that multimodality of comics and everybody reads comics differently. So how are you going to, like, well, that's an opportunity to sort of think about different ways of sort of adapting things, but it's also a challenge, right? Because are you going to try to capture that multimodality in the adaptation of the thing, which, you know, is really complicated, and you did such a great job of addressing that here and in your presentation. Can I go to you now, Sandra, and ask you, from your experience as a comics creator and from your personal experience, you know, how have comics sort of changed and adapted with you sort of over the course of your life? And how have you found comics as a form that sort of is able to sort of adapt to the changing needs of the moment, whether we're talking about the cultural moment, because obviously you've been doing pandemic comics, or sort of, you know, the needs of personal expression for yourself? Like, how have you found them to be sort of an adaptable medium for whatever you kind of need them to be at different moments?
I have a few answers to that, but I think the best answer I could give would be in terms of working with children and in a youth audience, because kids are really, it's so big now, like graphic novels for kids and young readers. A lot of the books that I get for, even for little kids or for YA, are, they talk about things that are not easy to talk about with kids. And so I think giving it in a graphic novel format or in a comic format, or even in a one-panel comic on Instagram talking about mental health or anxiety, which I do talk about a lot, I think it's sort of, it puts it in the arena that they're familiar with. They don't have to go and look out in, seek out materials on anxiety, or seek out materials on this thing that's difficult to talk about or new to them. They can have it in this format that is super kid-friendly. And it's not that it makes it funny, I don't want to say that, but it does with the images. You can always talk about anything in a graphic novel or comic format and sort of soften the edges a little bit with expressions, and sort of like watching a movie. Like instead of reading a big heavy text on something, if it's presented in a certain light or with certain images, I feel that it's easier to digest for certain audiences, and for sure for kids. So I've been able to talk and draw about anxiety, just hard stuff, loneliness of like working in this field, or weird family stuff in a comic format. My kids are already reading stuff like that. My 9-year-old read, actually he just turned 9. When he was 8, he read that book, like When Stars Are Scattered, and he learned about refugees and how brutal it is, how many of the people live in the world. So I think, I just think it's a really, what's that word? It's like a really appetizing, no, that's not the word. It's a good way to, it's an enticing way for kids to dive into material that maybe they wouldn't necessarily read a book about, or watch a movie about, or talk about. It's like a very, my kids see comics and they want them, they want to read them, they pick them up, and it doesn't matter what they're about. So I see that trend towards graphic novels and comics for kids is opening a whole realm of discussions that I don't think I would have had with my kids if they hadn't been reading this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, that gets back to sort of legitimacy questions and stuff, right? Because comics has so often been derided as being kids stuff, and yet the fact that they can be kids stuff is exactly one of the things that makes them so dynamic and special, because you know, it just speaks to the ways that we devalue kids stuff in general, right?
Yeah. I just had a meeting with I'm in a picture book group, and we just had a meeting beforehand, and one of the women in our group just said, you know, I just don't like my child bringing comic books home. I don't feel that it's literature. And I really got in there and was like, what do you mean? What are they about? And she mentioned that book, When Stars Are Scattered, about the refugee camp in Somalia, I think. And I said, this is an amazing book. This, like, you should read it. It's an incredible book to open all kinds of things to your kid.
Can I come to you? Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Eva.
Continue within the conversation. I wanted to say that paradoxically, comics can capitalize on that infantilizing reputation in other contexts, like for instance, in the context of research, they can create a sense of, democratization or playfulness or whatever, so they can be very useful precisely because of that reputation of being unthreatening, not so scholarly, right? So they can be used subversively in a way, right, to talk about serious things. Or in a sense, you were talking about adaptability and how they are adaptable to pedagogy, to research methods, to dissemination of research, to therapeutic contexts that we've been talking about, like, difficult subject, trauma. What they show and what they don't show is also important, the presence, absence kind of thing makes them really, because you raised the question of how they are uniquely equipped, what can be done with them, precisely because of those gaps, because of the openings that they leave, they can be, put to different uses, and including, of course, and this has been circling around all our conversations, like, they are also adaptable to the market's needs, right? And I just want to say, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this game Drawful. Drawful is an app that you can have on your phone, and I play it with my kids, and it is an amazing, actually it can turn each of us into a cartoonist, right? It's of course a commercial app that you have to buy. But one general observation is about remediation and how comics are really a part of the trend towards remediation, where on the one hand you have like hyper visibility, on the other hand you have like this kind of desire for absolutely individual signature, individual presence. So this is where this is visible in all those publications that I've been talking about. And Lisa, for instance, this book that I mentioned in my presentation, written by Shireen Hamdi and Paul Manunai, this is a whole package, this multi-platform publication where if you go to the U of T link, and I posted it earlier, you can go to each publication separately. This one will take you to a documentary about making of Lisa. This one will take you towards field notes that researchers have, the blogs that researchers have. Also, there is like the book itself is equipped with serious academic papers. Well, this one maybe not, but interviews and so on. So this is a really great opportunity, in terms of how you can create a kind of language incorporating comics that would raise new audiences for you in completely different, unexpected places sometimes.
Well, speaking of sort of new audiences and new formats, like I'll bring it to you, Amy, in terms of adapting comics to the online space and sort of the value of them in that space. Like, to your mind, what are some of the sort of, I mean, you've already spoken about this in your presentation, so I'm just asking you to kind of expand. But I mean, what are some of these sort of advantages and challenges of comics in that space? I mean, obviously, webcomics have been a huge area of growth in the past decade, and we've all seen that happening around us. But to your mind, why do comics work so well in kind of digital or online spaces? Because I think that they do work really well in those spaces, despite some of the challenges that we always have, sort of moving something from one quote unquote traditional sort of platform to another. But if you have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, of course. So I guess what I'm kind of thinking about accessibility maybe a bit differently than the other presenters were just speaking about. But I think that like comics and social media really lend themselves to a very broad readership or user audience that can engage with them in different ways. So people that may not be finding comics in their life elsewhere are now seeing them come up all the time on their Instagram feeds. So it's allowing a lot more people to kind of maybe see themselves in those comics that they're witnessing. And on the other side of it too, like I think it makes just the very practice of sharing your experience a bit more accessible for people that may not have the means or want to have their work kind of like quote unquote traditionally published. They can kind of post it to their own Instagram feed or engage with it in those communities online. And I think this is maybe a bit of a tangent, but when I'm thinking about, I guess, like the ease of access that a lot of these stories are having now on social media, through kind of these like grassroots, I guess, movements by people, it's almost kind of a bit of a return to like the underground comic scene in a bit, or in a way, just in the way that people are kind of able to, just have their simple drawings or simple comics or even more complex stuff being posted online. And then that is accessible to a much wider audience as well. So with that, I kind of get into this kind of back and forth with myself about like the ethics of looking at some of these comics and kind of opening them up to my own analysis of them. But yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question. I'm kind of going all over the place, but that's my thoughts on that.
No, that's okay. I have sort of a couple of other really broad questions for everybody, but if any of you would sort of like to ask each other questions or sort of, you know, have any responses that you wanted to add, like based on us sort of continuing this conversation, we could certainly do that.
Actually, yeah, if I could ask Sandra a question. So when I was preparing my presentation and then like even in the aftermath of it, I was just like thinking about, you know, like showing your work and then also replicating some of the comments that were posted in response to your work. And I guess I was just kind of wondering like what your take, number one, on that is, of people kind of using your work as like an analytical source, and also your experience of kind of like the communities that form in relation to your work or in response to your work, and how you kind of see that happening.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think community is like a theme that comes up a lot in my work, in all my work, all the different things I do. Community always comes up, and I suppose it's a really important thing to me. I think I posted that because my first thing I do when I'm feeling really freaked out is I draw, and I usually draw the day. And Linda Berry's syllabus and her like making comics books really changed the way I look at my diaries that I do in comic format. And it made me realize that it is a sort of way of like dumping out and kind of organizing what's happening. And it's just a way of calming myself down. But I've noticed that when I share those things, people really respond, and they are like sending me messages. Thank you so much for posting this. I can't believe this is happening. I feel so alone, like until I saw this. And meanwhile, I think I'm just posting these silly drawings of my day. But it did form a community, and I got like a lot of comic artists reached out and said, you know, I want to jump on this, and can we have a hashtag, and let's do it together, and we can like check in with each other. And then we even had like a couple of meetings online where we just got really silly and talked about the craziness of those early days of the pandemic. And then, you know, I'd be walking around in my neighborhood and people would be like, Sandra, like I saw you drew me in your comic, thank you so much. And then people would message me, oh, I was hoping I'd make it into your comic, thank you. Or so it suddenly was something really fun in a crazy dark time. And once again, I was like, oh, that's why I make art. This always happens. I always end up being like, oh, here I am with a really cool community of people going through the unknown. This is awesome. And it's like that with anxiety. I've got like, I write a lot about anxiety and family stuff and difficult things that I go through, and it always brings something awesome about. And I think like the more response you get to that of people being like, thank you, the more you realize, okay, this is a good thing. This is something I should be putting out there. This feels good. Because sometimes it's really vulnerable. Like it was my diary. It was basically my journal. And at one point, my friend Julie, who had hopped on board, who I met through that, I didn't know her super well before. We became close, and she was like, can you believe we draw our diary every day and then just post it with a bunch of hashtags? And I was like, I can't think about it too much. But it is like, you do know that you're doing a good thing when a community forms around.
Can I add something to it?
Of course.
Thank you so much, Sandra.
Yes.
This is like this wonderful description of how a community forms around you through this sharing. I want to say that, you know, during the last year teaching online, and there's been this kind of like push to do this asynchronously, meaning we couldn't see our students. We had to pre-record modules, and people were just coming and listening, and then, but we created a format which is called this, because it's a course on graphic narratives of resistance and feminist activism and so on. So we created an ongoing assignment called Sketchbook, where we actually asked them to draw. And those drawings can be anything, like drawing by hand, or we provide them with the option of, like, you know, using some apps for drawing, but they have to create sketches in response to some prompts, what's happening in the class, what they hear in lectures, and read in the material that we suggest for them to read. So we ask them to draw who they are, you know, how they are connected to systems of power, marginalization, you know, privilege, whatever. We also ask them to draw in response to specific course materials and how they impacted them. And what happens over time is that, you know, there is like a platform on eClass where people submit their sketchbooks for everyone to share and to view each other's drawings. And despite that asynchronous, you know, format, we witnessed this kind of emergence of some sort of community of learners, and also a lot of stuff spilled beyond that class as a result. So people started reaching out to other people by email, for instance, or you know, inviting people to meet on Zoom Live. So that's another example of how sharing of the sketchbook was a form of diary too, right? How that also necessarily kind of led to community is central to that kind of sharing, obviously. So just wanted to give you that example of how drawings in the context of the classroom, not necessarily with people who are trained to draw, can still have not only personal therapeutic function, because I personally, I mean, I took a couple of workshops with Martha Newbegin, and I felt like, oh my God, I'm starting to think with the other part of my brain that I hardly ever use, right? And I can see that happening for the students as well. But it's not only that, it is also like an invitation to just share with other people, really.
Yeah, I love that. And that's such a way that you could incorporate comics into courses that aren't necessarily about comics too. You know, we have this idea that it has to be a graphic novel course, or it has to be a comics course or something, or at the very least, a course on autobiography that incorporates a couple of comics, right? And then maybe we can talk about comics form. But I love the idea of sort of bringing the things that we know are really valuable about comics practice into all sorts of disciplines and fields and ways of teaching. And like, yeah, you're giving me so many great ideas. It's amazing. Any other questions for the presenters for each other? I have another kind of broad question for all of you, but I don't want to move away from this if you have more questions for each other. We okay? Okay, because I have a question for you, and I almost apologize for asking this because it is one of these kind of national identity questions that we've been talking about a lot at this conference and how it relates to your work. So obviously the title of this panel is like Futures of Canadian Comics, right? So it inevitably puts into dialogue, again, those conversations we've been having throughout the conference about sort of national identity and what we mean when we talk about Canadian comics. I know it's a big, potentially boring question to do, like, what are Canadian comics? We don't necessarily have to have that conversation. But another of the sort of connections I thought about with all of your presentations was the ways that you were proposing and addressing communities and affinities that aren't necessarily grounded in the national context, and how sort of that definitional stuff might relate interestingly to your approaches in that way. That you're instead sort of talking about communities based in disability and other commonalities of experience, or benefiting from the ability of the internet to be borderless, right? To connect people in ways not dependent on geography or necessarily their specific local cultural context, to connect people across those boundaries. So I thought in light of that, it might be worth asking, sort of extending from everybody's experience and expertise, like, how do you see the national interacting with your work, and is the national even sort of like an important context for thinking about your work? Like, does your work relate to quote unquote Canadian comics, and like, do you think that that's a useful frame for thinking about some of the things that you do or not? Or do you see kind of the work that you do as pushing back against this because you're talking about, again, sort of different affinities, different types of communities? And maybe I'll mix up the order here and come to you first with it, Amy. To see if you had thoughts about that. And, you know, like when we're talking about comics being online and stuff, you know, if we're talking about Canadian comics, you know, what does that mean? Does that mean comics consumed in Canada? Does that mean comics created by Canadians? Is that sort of a meaningful way to talk about comics? Because I mean, that's sort of a question about the future too, you know, what is going to sort of be the future of comics production and consumption? And is this national lens going to become sort of more and more outdated?
That's a really good question. And to be honest, like, it's not something that I really was thinking about, even like applying for this conference. Like when I was doing a lot of my research and getting ready to kind of start doing this project, it kind of just so happened that some of the accounts that I found really interesting were from Canadian cartoonists. And so then like thinking about those in relation to each other. But I think the work that I'm doing kind of pushes back against that national identity in a way, just because I mean, locating it on Instagram or online really kind of takes down those borders of geography. And I think that for me anyways, one of the really interesting thing that comics are doing online is that they're connecting people kind of across different continents even, or from different communities, and creating communities that are based in like other identities rather than just, you know, the country that we're born in or that we happen to be living in or viewing something from. So I guess like, I do think it is still very important to, you know, be aware of the work that's happening in Canada. But for me specifically, I think that my work is kind of situated a bit differently in different types of communities.
Yeah, fair enough. I was wondering if you wanted to respond to that, Sandra, since, you know, obviously your two presentations are in dialogue. How do you see kind of your work sort of interacting with a potential quote unquote Canadian identity? Obviously, that's been a term that we've been troubling for the past 2 days and for a lot longer than that in cultural studies in general. But do you see your kind of work sort of interacting with like a local context or a national context in an important way? Or do you see your community as sort of more broad-based than that? Because you already spoke about some of those local connections, but obviously your community is much larger than that as well.
Yeah, I would say my community expands. Like I don't even know what Canadian identity is. I'm from Toronto. I live in Quebec. Canada's, you know, reckoning with a pretty dark history at the moment. I'm reading, I picked up that book. It's like an anthology, Here Now, I think it's called. This Place, sorry, not at all. This Place. It's an anthology of stories from different Canadian comic artists talking about Canada's history with residential schools. And so maybe it just affects what I'm reading. I'm trying to really read. I'm just really being mindful about what I'm choosing to read right now. There's so many comics out there representing amazing Canadian voices that are just from different, just people that don't all look the same and feel the same and come from the same place. I'm really excited for Rosanna Fang's graphic novel called Living with Viola. That's coming out soon. And that's like, she talks a lot on Instagram about, she makes comics about being Asian and being Asian in Canada, being Asian in the world right now, what that means and what it looks like. And this book is also about her growing up with anxiety. And so I just like, I try to follow people who from different backgrounds, because like, what do I know? I don't even know what it means to feel Canadian, really. I don't relate with that at all, especially in Quebec, like especially here. I don't resonate with the Canadian identity at all.
Well, can I put the question? Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Could I put the question to you, Leah and Rachel, in terms of sort of how, because I mean, some of your work must sort of interact with Canadian funding agencies and stuff, right? So is your work sort of Canadian focused, or is it sort of more broad-based than that? And apologies if that's just like a silly question.
No, it's a complex question. The funding for NELS's core work, which includes making accessible format materials, that comes from Canadian, well, not Canadian, but like provincial libraries. So that's how we're being funded in that sense. But we're doing other work that's getting funding from like Employment and Social Development Canada. So we definitely get funding from different areas, but we are meant to focus on Canadian publishers, at least like that's who we're working with mostly. I think that with the next round of funding, we're going to be looking to purchase more international items, but that's because that's what the government wants, which is fine. We'll do what they tell us. It's good if they keep giving us money. And it's hard though. I don't know. Yeah, the disability community is like really, it's very online. So it is kind of more global in that sense. But yeah, we're going to keep trying to work with Canadians. Yeah, it's a hard question for us, I think.
Yeah, I know you'd be at sort of an interesting intersection of those things. Did you have thoughts about that, Eva? Like from your perspective, you know, like how sort of national identity interacts with some of the work you do, or do you just find it more useful to look beyond that frame in general and think more about the process and how people are doing that in all kind of different places and sort of disregard that local context?
You cannot disregard it because it is one of the elements of kind of like power setup,
Yeah.
right, in which we exist, and not everybody has equal access to national identity or even citizenship, right? And that's at the core of what we are talking about in the context of activism, for instance, how you have excluded citizens, you have non-citizens, right, or citizens who are better than. But because I teach in a feminist classroom, that is like one of the core issues, but it's always seen not as a primary identity, but in conjunction with how it connects to the transnational, global, settler colonialism, capitalism, militarism are not limited to national borders. They connect it multinationally. They sort of like part of the complex system, and so are individual like personal identities. So we approach our when we read comics in our classroom, we read them intersectionally, and that always complicates the national focus of the stories. And I just want to remind you, I mean, this is taking us back to my presentation. One of the textbooks that we use in graphic narratives of feminism is this book, Amplify. I don't know if you can see it, Amplify. Does it show? Yeah, okay. So that is also the U of T Press, and it's basically a textbook, but it takes it's graphic narratives of feminist resistance, but it has vignettes, 7 vignettes of global feminist activism, like Pussy Riots, Layma Bowie in Africa, you have the Black Panthers and Kathleen Cleaver, Idle No More, of course, Rota Zora, and so on, Harsha Walia. So these programmatically contextualize things, transnationally, globally, and national identity is just one piece of the, puzzle for students, for us to unpack, to understand how it needs to be viewed intersectionally. So yeah, and that is also, the kind of consistent with theoretical approaches that we base it on to have this kind of feminist platform that is also, decolonial and sort of like not purely nationalistic or nation focused.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, I have a final big, broad question for everybody. And then if people want to start putting questions in the chat that they might have for the panelists, we can start doing that as well. But which is to ask you, of course, what you believe the futures of Canadian comics or comics more broadly are from sort of the perspectives of your research. What are you hoping from your perspectives to see from sort of this form, from the culture of comics, from comics in your specific spaces moving forward? I mean, if you had to say what are the things that you sort of care most about from your perspective in terms of what you want to see moving forward, what would those things be? And maybe I'll start with you, Eva. I'll come to you first with it. What are the futures of comics sort of in your area of scholarship, your area of research? What do you want to see, or what do you think might happen?
Well, I think it's already happening, and like we just scratched the surface of it today or in the previous panel, but definitely I feel like because of, again, the so-called push towards democratization of knowledge production, and that is, again, a double-edged sword, right? Democratization meaning, for some people, dumbing it down, for others, creating access, right? But also, for yet others, creating an opportunity for commercial commodification, right? So all this is really messy, as we already observed in some other contexts, talking about other issues related to how comics do their cultural and political work. So I think it is going to intensify the push towards those hybrid forms, in academia. Definitely there will be more funding given to projects that include knowledge translation, that incorporates innovative platforms. And it's already like comics will not just in the book form, but also digital storytelling, right? And other like, maybe animated features, maybe still other interesting platforms. So I see that as an open road towards like mass adoption of, cartoons in scholarly contexts, in classrooms, first of all, which will be actually wonderful because I've had very good experiences myself inviting students to become cartoonists, quote unquote, right? But I feel like some presses, and again, we had a panel of small presses. We didn't invite, we didn't have any academic presses invited to talk about that, but it seems like Matthew's book has already been picked by Queen's, I guess, and it's going to be this hybrid, again, dissemination format. The U of T is like, I feel like at the cutting edge of it already with several books that they have already published, and the series is still, you know, yielding new fascinating titles. So yeah, I don't see any problems in the future. On the contrary, I think that comics are going to be thriving and be amenable to multiple uses and multiple contexts.
I love that. I love that. I'm hoping for all of those things, obviously, as someone who also studies comics. Sandra, what are your hopes and dreams for comics of the future? What do you think is going to continue happening sort of in the kind of areas that you're working in?
I'm sorry, can you hear it's storming? Is that too loud?
Wow.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay. Wow, I feel like in the children's book industry, comics are taking off. It's so hot right now. And the books that I look at and that I read a lot of kids books and YA as well as adult books. And it's so cool because you can just see that younger generation is so much more open and awesome than our generation. So visually in a comic, you can make people, without saying it, you can just make people look different. You can make people gender fluid. You can make them gay, but not as a main thing about them. That's not a main thing about the character. It's just like that. It's just everyone's super different, and it's so refreshing and it's so awesome. And that means that generation is just going to expect that in the books they read and in the comics they read, and it's already there. And so when I'm reading my books, my comic books for adults, like my graphic novels, I don't see that, but I see it coming for the younger one. Like coming in, those younger books are way more diverse and way more reflective of what's really happening. So I keep thinking, oh, it's so cool. Like, what are the adult books going to be like for my kids? They're going to be so much more reflective of who we are. So that's really exciting. I love looking at the YA comic books in like Drawn and Quarterly and in those kinds of bookshops.
Yeah, I'm really curious about sort of how it's going to change the status of comics for people to be kind of growing up with. I mean, when I teach comics, it's usually like I ask the question of, have you read comics before? And if people have read comics before, it still seems to be the only comics that they have read are Archie comics, which I love Archie comics. That's not a put down of Archie comics, but it's still like they're going to be reading a lot different things sort of moving forward. Can I bring it to you, Leah and Rachel, because this is going to be a big question for your work. What are sort of and this is a huge question. I know you're not going to be able to answer it, you know, in 2 minutes, but you know, what are some of the things that you're hoping for in terms of comics and accessibility moving forward? Like, is there anything that comics producers, that comics creators, that you know, people who study comics can be doing to kind of help in the sort of this quest to make comics more accessible?
Yeah, for sure. I just say that I just want everyone to make everything completely accessible. Like Leah and I are very hard advocates. We work for an organization that's an advocate for people who are living with print disabilities. And both of us are constantly training publishers and staff on how to make things accessible and just to kind of like build that into your workflow. So what you're creating is actually going to be accessible to everybody to consume. So anyone who has any type of print disability, and then that's really actually can be really exciting. So I said it earlier, you can get really creative with this stuff, right? And I think comic books are like a really key place. And I know the comic books in the accessibility world have been a really big challenge for a long time. I sit on a working group that's trying to update accessibility for fixed layout books. And we're talking about different ways we can read code comics so they can be accessible to screen readers and people with different print disabilities. And it's a really big challenge, but there's a lot of really intelligent people, a lot of people who are really talented, that have been in the industry for a long time, that have living experiences, that are working towards this. And I would really like to see more comic book creators and comic book scholars join that conversation and get just as excited as we are about making comics accessible. Because I think everyone can agree, like, it's exciting, right? Like, we all love comics, we all love education, we all like outreach and sharing these stories. So why not also challenge ourselves to figure out a way that we can share it in ways for people who we might not really think about, right? A lot of people don't really think about accessibility unless they live with disabilities or they have someone close to them that live with disabilities, to no fault of their own, right? So it's just a way of just like shifting the way you look at your work, and really advocating and working towards ways you can make your own work more accessible, and also experimenting with multiple modalities maybe, and really reaching out to people in the community. There are a lot of professionals out there with living experiences with different types of disabilities that would be more than eager to you know, consult and help create these new forms of beautiful books.
Did you want to add to that, Leah?
Yeah, I think, again, she covered it quite well, but what I'm starting to see more is that a couple of the publishers that we've been working with are incorporating image descriptions into some of their graphic novels that they're putting out. So, I mean, that's so exciting to see. So I really think there is a growing awareness about accessibility and the ways to implement it. And I think that basically what needs to happen in Canadian comics in any industry is for people to just keep talking about it, to just keep raising awareness, and then, you know, all of the options that are out there, people will be drawn to, and they'll start picking what they can do, which, you know, image descriptions, they're not perfect. They can be, you know, if you've got an image description embedded in a comic story, it can be kind of distracting. It can kind of take away from the narrative. But if you write them well, like if you work on it, it can kind of make a beautiful narrative. So there's just, so it's a place to start. But yeah, really just raising awareness about accessibility. So everyone talk about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's such a buzzword in comic studies, right? You know, we tell ourselves that comics are this great accessible medium and everything, but if we're not making comics accessible to everybody, we're not living up to the thing that we're always talking about, right? Which is why I think what you're doing is so important, and having those conversations is really important. Amy, I'll come to you with this question because you haven't had a chance yet. What do you sort of see the future of webcomics and webcomics communities being? Like, do you have an idea of how this space is going to sort of shape and grow sort of in the next 5-10 years? It's a huge question. You don't have to be a prognosticator, but just, you know, what are your sort of hopes and dreams for that space?
Yeah, I guess my hope would be that it just continues to grow, and that comics become kind of more and more present on social media and on other websites, and are being kind of used by people as resources, because I think that they are in some of these communities that I've started to look at. And like as Sandra was saying, that, you know, representing mental health or your experiences is a great way to kind of form these communities of mutual experience. So my hope would be that that just kind of continues to grow, and then hopefully seeps out into the mainstream, and that these conversations around mental health and how they're being represented and engaged with kind of extend into our larger communities. Everyone had such great answers. Aside from just kind of echoing what everyone else was saying, I don't have much else to add other than that. But yeah, my kind of optimistic hope would just be to kind of see things just snowball and continue to kind of grow and become more and more accessible.
I love this. This has been such an optimistic panel, which is such a good panel for our last panel of the conference. But we do have a question in the chat from Julie. Julie, if you want to ask it on mic, you're welcome to, but I can read it for you if you would like.
I can say something. It's the discussion in the chat. I know you folks have all been talking and we're listening to you. That's really good because it's gone into zines are a thing, which is always good. My question to you was, do you think institutions help or hurt the future of comics? And and how do you feel about that? Because we kind of started this thing talking about that a little bit, and we've been talking around that. So like, will punks just do whatever they want anyways, and it doesn't really matter, was my question. Or do you think that institutions, like, they can be helpful, but are they also going to domesticate comics in ways that they kind of shouldn't? So what are your thoughts there? That's what I want to know.
Can I ask you, Julie, what do you mean by domesticating comics? Because once you, if I'm playing Drawful or whatever with my kids over Zoom, and it's literally happening in my domestic space, with very limited skills that I have as a cartoonist. Is this domesticating comics?
Probably not. Like, I'm thinking you're using comics in a different way.
As entertainment, as a release of whatever tensions after a long day, as a way of connecting to my kids. Yeah. But domesticating, meaning, I don't know, in this case, I see more the danger of commercialization than domestication,
I don't necessarily. In Canada, we've got a real tendency through different kinds of funding bodies or through collecting to kind of make something happen. And there was a point when we were talking about the archival stuff where somebody said some people don't want to archive their stuff, or they don't want to sell their originals, like they don't want to even donate them. And so I'm interested in that tension. That's what I'm kind of meaning about it. But I don't mean those new practices. Absolutely not.
Okay. Now I just was wondering if I can go first to answer your question, or try to answer your question, was about like institutions that we talked about, not just archives, but art galleries exhibiting comics as well. On the other hand, I'm taking it back to my presentation, that is like e-class repositories where we have and these are retired and they are archived as well in a digital form. I can archive all my online courses that I've been teaching over the past several years. So there is this secret repository of what my class has produced, and there's a lot of punk and grunge and whatever in that, so homemade kind of quality, but I think that it's okay. I mean, this is another way of preserving that, right? I mean, for some kind of future maybe researchers interested in that. And you talk about zines also. I want to say that this is a new thing for me to do it through sketchbook and comic sketchbooks. In the past, we used to produce like a class zine at the end of the year, and these have not been deposited anywhere. They actually have been just circulated among class participants, and I have just one copy and that's it. But yeah, I guess punk is alive in those productions, definitely, in feminist classrooms, which still constitute some sort of marginalized spaces anyways within the academy.
I'm sorry, am I not?
Yeah, okay, there's a question here. Do you ask your students it's okay to preserve their work like this? Yeah, because they know that I'm the only person who will, and the other course director, the only people who will have access to it. And every time we want to use anything from that e-archive, we reach out. So for instance, in my presentation, I posted a slide from a student who actually produced this in the classroom. She did research on coping with mental health during the pandemics. It was part of a research class course. So she drew autobiographical comics and then shared them in the focus group context, eliciting people's responses. I wanted to show you examples of that. So I contacted her and she okayed the slides, she okayed everything that was on it. So that's how I would do it, conforming to some ethical kind of standards of sharing student work, not without their permission.
Did anyone else have thoughts on this question? I mean, it could be a question for you, Amy, in terms of how do you see sort of, because I mean, one of the things that people have talked about quite a bit with webcomics and comics that are online is, a lot of those do get reprinted in books. And are we losing sort of some of the dynamic interactions that we have when those things are in what is now sort of their original format online? Is that a form of domesticating comics? Like, are we losing some of the vibrancy that they had in those spaces, especially because the community, as you've been talking about, is so much a big part of how the meaning of those texts works, basically?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. And thank you, Julie, for this question. I kind of touched on this a bit earlier when we were talking about accessibility, and just, I guess, like my thoughts on as like a scholar or researcher that's looking at these comics and kind of, in a sense, bringing them into the institution as something to be dissected and looked at. Like, I wonder about like the ethics of that, and if that is kind of detracting from those like grassroots community by making them more public and by kind of bringing the communities that are forming online to attention in my work. So it's kind of this like ethical struggle that I'm having of, I mean, like whether, like how deep I'm going to dive into things and what kind of changing the form, bringing it from like Instagram, like you said, to a book, like how does that change the form? And then a step further, how does it change what's happening in those communities by me kind of unpacking what's happening in them? So I think it's a really interesting question that you bring up, Julie, in terms of like, are we taking away or like, are we in a sense by domesticating those or kind of bringing them into the institution, how is that actually affecting what's happening in those communities? And I don't really have like an answer as to what's happening or what we should do, but it definitely is something that's been on my mind, and I'd love to hear others' thoughts about it as well.
Did you have thoughts about that, Sandra, sort of from your perspective as a comics creator?
I don't know if I can really give much of an insight into that, but it does make me think about how, because we sort of talked about that earlier, about bringing comics into places for people who necessarily like don't identify as someone who draws or who don't want to make comics. I know Linda Berry does that a lot in her artist residencies in universities. And I just love what she does. She just like, because I think the thing is that what you realize when you're doing comics or when you're teaching kids comic drawing, like people want to draw, people love drawing. And when you make it super accessible the way she does, like she teaches sometimes doctors, but she'll have this one class where they all have to draw and it's hilarious and they all get super vulnerable and silly and play, which is so important. And I always thought, like, as someone who came into making comics kind of late, I always made them, but I didn't know I was making them. I was just doing it. I sort of felt that it was really cool that she just got all these random people, adults, to draw and play with her and have fun and be kids. So in that one specific situation I can think of, I think it's pretty awesome to bring that format in. And, you know, she does, the stuff she does is not necessarily like pretty, it's pretty weird, but I love it. I think it's great.
Also, shout out to Linda Berry because she's just in a class by herself. Unbelievable, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Do we have other thoughts about that question, or do we have other questions that people would like to ask the panel? I know, Candida, you had a comment, and you can certainly pose it as a question if you would like.
This is actually something different, but I'm in a surprisingly optimistic mode today about the work comics can do in disrupting institutions, so kind of reversing Julie's concern, although it's still a concern. But I don't know, and maybe you can take my hand on, I can never figure out how to do that. My question is actually super specific about accessibility in creating comics, and it comes back to the points that Leah and Rachel had been making about how it needs to be built into the creation, but it also relates to Eva talking about teaching. And I'm just going to rain a little bit on the Linda Berry parade, using Linda Berry in classrooms from a very specific experience I had teaching a course that I had designed around. It was an autobiocomics course, and I had designed it around every class students doing a sketch portrait, a little hand-drawn selfie as their way to take their own attendance. This is an exercise I borrowed from someone else, and it usually works really well. I walked into the class and realized I had a student who does not have use of her hands, and she uses an iPad at home and has various accommodations provided by the university. And I immediately had to rethink my first day exercise and my daily practice of using Linda Berry's exercises to get students to sketch and draw in class. So I'm really interested to learn what might be available, not just for professional artists, but for us to use in our workshops and our classes or for ourselves, adaptations that can happen at the stage of creation. And also, I kind of want to trouble the assumption that all students can use Linda Berry's exercises. This was a student who very clearly does not have use of her hands, but I talked about it with the students afterwards because the student is actually very open and wanted to talk about that. And I learned that 2 other students have rheumatoid arthritis, but had not disclosed that ever before and have real trouble gripping pens. So it made me wonder how many times I've used Linda Berry's exercises in my classes and put students in difficult positions that they didn't feel they could disclose. So I've become really sensitive to the assumption that all students who take comics reading classes, not comics making classes, can also make comics, because that's kind of become our established pedagogy. Students should draw or trace in order to understand what they're reading. So it's kind of a big question. I thought about presenting a paper on it at one point. I realized I'm not through thinking about this at all. And I would like to draw on the expertise of this panel and ideas you might have about ways to adapt the Linda Barry method, which is becoming so dominant in comics teaching for students who have limited use of hands.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Candida, like especially in terms of, that assumption of accessibility of comics, that we were sort of mentioning earlier, we just assume everybody wants to and can express themselves in particular ways, and that's not always necessarily true, both from a desire and from like a physical standpoint, right? Anyway, Eva, I think you had thoughts.
Yeah, we have that, well, we've also encountered that problem, Candida, obviously. So in our instructions, of course, we also do Linda Barry exercises with students who can do them, of course, but then if your student has an iPad, for a student like that, you could probably suggest some kind of apps and work with ready-mades, which, I mean, I've seen some amazing results. Students who downloaded, for instance, Canva or comic book app for iPad. It's where they can also make their own compositions if they still can, if there's a way for them to operate that app. So some of them they have to pay for instance, that comic book app is $3.99, I think. The other ones are free. So Canva is a free tool, which is used for doing infographics, and they can play with that. Well, again, we're still talking about other forms of ableism, and I guess that Leah and Rachel's presentation was unpacking that already, that you cannot remedy everything, but accepting, working with ready-mades, for instance, and working like collaging. So zines again come to mind. It's the same technique that you would use collaging in a zine, and that could also help you to encourage, maybe scrapbooking or other things that people could do. That's just what we do in our classes. I don't know if that helps.
I just want to respond quickly that I didn't want to stigmatize the students and make it very visible as well for students who hadn't disclosed. And the particular student who really triggered my thinking on this has to lie on the floor to use the iPad because she has other disabilities. So it's also about not marking students in class who cannot make by hand. And I know there's no easy answers. Technology seems to be the way to accommodate this, but I'm just curious to hear about what's already in place for professional artists, if Leah and Rachel know about that, or if anyone has other ideas and ways to kind of make it so that it's not just accommodating students with disabilities, but also not like, marking them as disabled in the process of making comics.
But yeah, did you want to respond to that, Leah or Rachel? We're sort of out of our time, but if you have some sort of final thoughts on it, we could do that.
I think it's a hard question. I think that more and more people are becoming comfortable with disclosing their disabilities, but of course it's not a necessary thing. The first thing that came to mind, and I'll admit, I'm not a comic scholar, so I've never heard of the Linda Barry method, but I was, the first thought that came to my head was when you were discussing the exercises, that maybe you could give all students the option of maybe perhaps either drawing a selfie of themselves or writing an image description, and then even that's immediately bringing the concept of image description, the concept of accessibility and inclusion and blindness into the classroom, like from the get-go, so people could choose either way. I'm not sure if there's a student who can't write or type, then obviously that's another level to deal with, but I'm sure that some people would be interested in kind of wording it, and then maybe someone else could draw it and you could pair people up, something like that. Just throwing that out there. I don't know if there's I don't know about any professional tools that artists are using when they have those kinds of issues. I'm sure they're out there, but I don't have the scoop on that. That's my 1 cent maybe.
Oh, and Candida says that we are technically allowed to go to 5:30 if we would like to. So we can, And now I'm all like thinking that we were just wrapping up. So I'm like not sure where to go from here. But yeah, I like all those ideas that you're bringing up in terms of, you know, that speaks to people just with different desires and interests and types of literacy as well. Because I mean, again, I've been thinking a lot in the sort of recent years about that assumption about comics accessibility. And it's something we repeat to ourselves again and again and again, you know, going back to sort of Scott McCloud and sort of legitimizations of comics in the 90s, right? Talking about how accessible this form is, and it's a word that we've used many times in this panel today, and yet part of the accessibility of comics should hopefully be sort of their multimodality, and that can perhaps speak to some of the ways that we sort of, you know, troubleshoot or theorize ways to, you know, make comics truly accessible to everybody. And I think that that's a really good ongoing conversation to keep having. But did anybody else have additional thoughts about that? You, Rachel?
There's a great idea from Irene, I think, in the chat that maybe we should share with everyone about,
yeah, of course.
what was it? Where I lost it now because it went too far, but partnership exercises, I think, yeah. So Candida, right? You can put together people who will collaborate on creating a comics. So that could also be a way of getting a student who needs some special accommodation involved.
I love that idea, and I just want to flag that so much of Linda Berry's work is solo work. So again, I love her approach and I love it, but when I think about it through this lens, it's actually kind of problematic. So you have to adapt a lot of her work because so much of it about is exploring your own creativity, your memory, your childhood. And as soon as it becomes partner work, you're introducing a whole other dynamic. So I have no answers. I think we need to trouble the way the Linda Berry method has become part of not comics making courses, because students who sign up for that presumably are ready to disclose and ask for accommodations. But in an English department, when a student signs up for a course on studying comics, I think they may not expect to suddenly be put in the position of having to make them.
Yeah. I think it might be interesting to like look into, also kind of just popped in my head, and it's a little off field, but kind of in the right area. There's a place in Edmonton called the Nia Haggerty Center, and they teach art to people with intellectual disabilities. So it'd be kind of cool to like look into some of the methods that some of these art institutions that are focused on education on art, and see how they deal with different types of disabilities and how they deal with navigating. Because I do know there's always going to be that tension between students that like are okay with calling out that they need accommodations versus the students that aren't, and it can cause a lot of anxiety either way. And I don't think there's ever going to be like at least I can't think of a really easy way to do that. I mean, judging from my own experience, I experienced the first half of my education not doing, because I have disabilities, I didn't go for accommodations, and it caused a lot of roadblocks for me. And then I got accommodations, but it kind of brought different problems, right? It meant that I had to go to my professor and tell them, look, here's a letter saying these are my accommodations, this is my disability. And then I felt like weirdly outed. And like sometimes the professors were really helpful and sometimes they weren't, and it would cause this new kind of tension that wasn't there before. And I don't know if there's a really smooth way to like not bump up against that in some way. But what I'd be really interested in is, because I do know there's a lot of artists out there that live with disabilities and work with disabilities. And there's also a lot of scholars out there that have living experiences that might not necessarily be directly in the comic world, but they are in the art creation world. So it would be kind of cool maybe to explore a bit what their methodologies are for education and for dealing with different types of disabilities, and maybe trying to adapt those into your own pedagogy. Just a thought that bumped in my head. Also, another thought that bumped in my head is when you mentioned Scott McCloud, is that he was on the Blind comic panel. So he's like doing a lot of work for accessibility in commons right now. It was a lot of fun to talk with him, but yeah.
We have a number of sort of comments and suggestions sort of going off in the chat, which are really, really fascinating. If anybody has sort of a comment that they want to do on mic or sort of pose it as a question, we can certainly do that. But otherwise, you're welcome to check out the comments in the chat, sort of different suggestions for.
Yeah, these are very thoughtful comments indeed. And I think that they just suggest clearly, like, you know, that this has to be decided on case-by-case basis, maybe in consultation with the student, what they are comfortable with, rather than adopting some kind of, across the board policy, like how we're going to accommodate and what kind of exercises we're going to do. So it requires a lot of sensitivity, and as I say, like maybe approach on a case-by-case basis rather than overall policy.
We are recording the chat, so anybody who wants a list of these things, we can certainly provide it.
Excellent. Good to know, Dominic. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it makes me even wonder about some of the universalism sort of at play in, even this way of thinking about representing personal experience, because I sometimes worry about that when I assign those types of assignments. Like, does every student kind of want to produce like an autobiographical kind of like thing in class and share with everybody? And some students really benefit from that, and some students find that very stressful and very too vulnerable, and it's not something that they want to do. And I sometimes worry about putting that expectation on students as well, that sort of everybody's going to come away from that and have this enriching experience, but it's maybe not the best thing for everybody. And I sometimes struggle to navigate that. So that would again have to be in a longer conversation about sort of pedagogies around comics making and the ways that we incorporate these things into our classrooms.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, I've had experience, and Amy Mazuita, you may have been in this class like a decade ago, I can't remember, but I gave students the option of doing an autobio comic as their final assignment for a course where we read them. And the student said, I haven't experienced any trauma, so I can't make an autobio comic. And it was like, that's when I realized the way that we select the comics we teach, the ones that we privilege. And the student ended up doing a fantastic autobio comic, but she was worried it seemed silly or trivial because we do emphasize trauma so much and like huge issues. So that's a whole other sort of thing to raise in terms of our expectations for what we want students to talk about when we talk about autobio comics.
That was basically what I was thinking of. Yeah, sort of the expectations of what the genre of this looks like, and how not every student is going to be comfortable sort of operating within that genre.
That's going to be for another day. That's one reason. It's a good reason to teach Dave Collier, because he's anti-trauma. Like, thinking about what is it like for people who do everyday life comics, and what does banality look like, right? Can you draw the most boring thing that happened to you? Can you figure out what you would do? To me, I just wanted to say, just to add to that I did have a student, and I think it might be the one who requested The Walking Dead, so it is that person, because he's really into comics, and and he really wanted to experience them, and he took my comics class, and I'm like, okay, so you're completely blind, what are you going to do? And he figured out what he was going to do, but one of the things he did was use 3D printing. And I did not. So I think that when we think about technology, I think that's what we do. I would totally agree with what Rachel and Leah are saying. Like, we need to go to practitioners who do this already and talk through it with them.
Yeah, it's really good, important to have.
We is anybody who's in a situation where there's some learning. I mean, that's who we is, right? So it doesn't matter if it's in a university or if it's in a workshop or what it is. And because I think that Canada's right. We're pretty ableist in our understanding of how this kind of learning works, and we need to unlearn all that. And I think that's a big challenge to me. So I really want to thank the panel as well as Canada for making me think about that some more. I still love Linda Berry though.
Yeah, I think it's really important to include people with living experiences, right? Like about maybe like 80% of our staff at NELS are people with living experiences. We can't create accessibility without including people who live with experience and the people who are creators that have living experiences. That's invaluable, because one of the things that we bump up against sometimes through our own work at NELS is that we have people that are trying to create accessible things, and it's coming from a really good place, but they're not using accessibility testers, or they're not including staff that have living experiences, or creators that have living experiences, and it just falls short because it's not actually accessible. And then the community gets really exhausted. The community is exhausted for advocating for themselves, and they shouldn't have to advocate for themselves anymore. It should be something that we all kind of come together and help with, right? Because people with disabilities are tired. We're really tired, and like, we need help, right? And we know that people want to help us. We know we have all these, like everyone on this panel, everyone in the audience right now, you guys are all amazing, and you guys have all these great ideas, and you're all doing really great work through education, through creation. And so like, it's really great that we're together talking about this, and we need to get more people with living experiences into the conversation as well.
Any final thoughts as we wrap up today? We've just got a couple of minutes, and then we're going to have a short break before the final remarks of the conference.
Do we have time for questions? One more
Yeah,
question?
we've got time for one more question if you've got one.
Well, I had a couple, maybe a comment and a question. One of the things, just going back to what Candida was saying about the trauma, I do like the serious, I do teach serious comics more than I do funny ones. But one thing I liked about Sandra's presentation was, and also her pandemic daily comics, was just that she was writing about everyday things that, not like traumatic things, but just, you know, things that you do with the kids, or what didn't work, or today it was hard doing this. My other question was just to ask Amy, like you talked a lot in your presentation about how people cared and there's a big community, but I wanted to know, were there nasty comments like in the Instagram posts? And then finally, just to Eva, I read that book Lisa, and I really liked the depiction of the illness and the decisions that the two protagonists had to do. But actually, I felt that the graphic that was a bit forced in putting two people that didn't really have much to do with each other into a kind of dialogue. And so I don't know if that's because they were trying to teach too much. Maybe these are too long for the time we have. I felt like that graphic narrative was forcing the didacticism more than the actual story. Anyway, I've been sitting here listening to all your presentations.
I can give a quick answer to the question you posed to me. Short answer is yes, there are nasty comments. I'm just really starting this research on this project, so I haven't really done a whole lot of looking at everything yet. I find that in some of the smaller, well, maybe smaller is the incorrect way to put it, but some, I guess, accounts that have smaller followings, I find seem to be a lot more positive and a lot more kind of based in care and support. I find when we get into some of the accounts that have like 100,000 followers or a very large following, people kind of slip in as trolls and just are just trying to be antagonists, it seems. So yeah, the short answer is yes, but I haven't done a lot of analyzing of it yet, but it's a great question.
And to speak to what you said about the, I should have mentioned that I do talk a lot about like difficult things in my comics, but my favorite stories, and I teach this to kids, is like making a story out of like eating your cereal and like finding what's your middle, what's the tension, what's the excitement, because everything has a story in it. And you can make, and when you're doing these kinds of things with kids, they make the best comics about like sleeping in or like their mom being in a bad mood, and those, I find that when you start observing those types of things, and that's what I was drawing in the COVID diaries, is like, there's like so much richness in just everyday routines of you know, a boring life, which I don't really believe in. And it's good to talk about the hard things and be honest about what's happening. But yeah, I love comics about nothing. I love it. It's my favorite.
I'm going to choose that as a positive note to end on. And thank you so much to all of our panelists and our audience today with your wonderful questions. I've enjoyed this conversation so much, and what a wonderful panel to end on. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.